The uneasy calm of the Middle East, a peace held together by the thinnest of threads, was shattered just before midnight. The trigger, when it came, was predictable yet shocking in its audacity, in response to a precision Israeli airstrike just days prior. An attack that had decapitated key Islamic Jihad leadership within Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Iran chose to cast aside decades of shadow warfare. Tehran's retaliation was not to be conducted through its usual proxies or with plausible deniability. Instead, it was a direct, state-on-state military assault, a crossing of a red line that had, until this moment, been considered inviolable. The action was a culmination of years of escalating tensions, a brutal cycle that had intensified since the Hamas attack of October 2023 and the subsequent direct strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities in mid-2025. The decision in Tehran was born from a complex mixture of internal pressure and strategic calculation. The regime, already contending with massive anti-government protests and a collapsing economy throughout late 2025, felt its legitimacy was on the line. Allowing another high-profile Israeli strike to go unanswered was seen as an untenable sign of weakness. Furthermore, hardliners within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps argued that Israel's perceived impunity had to be challenged directly. They believed that only a significant show of force could re-establish deterrence and demonstrate Iran's military reach, sending a powerful message not only to Jerusalem but also to Washington and other regional adversaries. The recent conclusion of indirect nuclear talks in Geneva, fraught with disagreement over missiles and proxies, only added to the sense that diplomacy was failing. The context for this drastic escalation was a region already simmering with conflict. The war in Gaza had never truly ended, merely transitioned into a grinding insurgency. Skirmishes with Hezbollah on Israel's northern border were a daily reality. The Red Sea remained a treacherous waterway, with Houthi rebels continuing their campaign against international shipping. Against this backdrop, the Israeli strike in the Bekaa Valley was the final provocation. For Iran, it was an attack too close to its core interests, targeting a key ally in a territory seen as crucial to its regional strategy. The leadership concluded that the risks of inaction now outweighed the dangers of a direct, albeit carefully calibrated, military response. The final orders were given as the sun set over Tehran. The operation was designed to be a spectacle, a display of missile and drone capability that would dominate news cycles across the globe. The objective was not necessarily to inflict mass casualties, which Iran knew would guarantee a devastating all-out war, but to demonstrate that no part of Israel was beyond its reach. It was a high-stakes gamble, betting that a powerful, but contained strike would satisfy domestic calls for revenge while being just limited enough to avoid triggering a full-scale regional conflagration. As the first wave of drones lifted off from launch sites across western Iran, the Middle East held its breath, teetering on the brink of a new and terrifying chapter. The first indications of the attack came not from explosions, but from a constellation of alerts across military radar screens in Israel, Jordan, and at American bases throughout the region. The initial wave consisted of hundreds of Shahad-type drones, slow-moving and relatively easy to track, launched from deep within Iranian territory. Their flight path was a deliberate arc across Iraq and Syria, a slow-moving vanguard designed to do one thing: saturate Israel's multi-layered air defense systems. These drones were the opening act, a swarm of targets intended to draw the fire of Israeli interceptors and exhaust their valuable ammunition, clearing a path for the more formidable threats that would follow them several hours later. As the drones methodically buzzed their way towards Israeli airspace, the second and third phases of the attack were unleashed. From launch pads in western Iran, and from sites controlled by pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, Syria, and even Yemen, a barrage of cruise and ballistic missiles roared into the night sky. The scale was staggering, one of the largest and most complex missile barrages in modern military history. This was not a token gesture, it was the full might of Iran's conventional missile arsenal on display. The cruise missiles, flying low and fast, followed complex flight paths to evade early detection, while the ballistic missiles soared high into the upper atmosphere on a parabolic trajectory towards their designated targets across the Israeli state. The sheer complexity of the coordinated assault was a testament to years of Iranian planning. The timing was meticulously calculated so that the slow-moving drones and the faster missiles would, in theory, arrive over Israeli skies in a compressed window. This created a nightmarish scenario for air defense operators, forcing them to distinguish between, track, and engage hundreds of simultaneous threats of varying speeds, altitudes, and trajectories. The sky over the Levant became a sprawling, lethal chessboard, with each drone and missile a piece in Iran's audacious gambit to overwhelm the most sophisticated air defense network in the world. The intended message was clear: no matter how advanced your shield, our quiver is vast. The targets chosen by Iran revealed a strategic, rather than indiscriminate, approach. Intelligence reports flowing into the Kiryat, Israel's military headquarters in Tel Aviv, indicated that the incoming ballistic missiles were primarily aimed at military installations. Key Air Force bases in the Negev desert, including Nevatim, and sensitive intelligence-gathering sites on Mount Hermon in the Golan Heights, were among the primary targets. This focus suggested that Iran's immediate goal was to strike at the heart of the Israeli military machine, degrading its ability to project power. While this was a cold comfort to the civilians huddled in shelters, it signaled that Tehran was, for now, stopping short of deliberately targeting population centers, a move that would have made a catastrophic Israeli response an absolute certainty. Even before the first Iranian drone crossed into Israeli airspace, a powerful and well-rehearsed international defensive operation was in full motion. For years, the United States Central Command and the Israeli Defense Forces had drilled for this exact scenario. As soon as the launches were detected, a seamless network of shared intelligence and coordinated response clicked into place. In the eastern Mediterranean, the U.S. Navy destroyers USS Carney and USS Arleigh Burke, both equipped with the advanced Aegis combat system, began tracking and engaging dozens of incoming drones and missiles, firing their own interceptors to thin the herd long before it reached land. Over the skies of Iraq and Jordan, the air forces of the United States and the United Kingdom became crucial partners in Israel's defense. Squadrons of American F-15E Strike Eagles, operating from bases in the region, were vectored to intercept the swarms of drones. With superior look-down and shoot-down radar and a full complement of air-to-air missiles, these jets acted as a roving aerial shield, systematically destroying scores of the slow-moving threats. They were joined by Typhoons from the British Royal Air Force, which also engaged and neutralized a number of drones, demonstrating a pre-planned coalition response designed to protect not only Israel but also Allied airspace and personnel throughout the region. As the remaining threats closed in on Israel, the country's own formidable, multi-layered air defense network roared to life. The first line of engagement was the Arrow 3 system, designed to intercept ballistic missiles high in the exosphere, far above the Earth. Lower down, the Arrow 2 and David's Sling systems targeted the ballistic and cruise missiles that made it through the initial screen. Finally, for the drones and low-flying cruise missiles that penetrated the outer layers, dozens of Iron Dome batteries stationed across the country fired their Tamir interceptors, filling the night sky with trails of smoke and the flash of successful kills. It was a symphony of defensive technology, operating at a scale never before tested in live combat. The result of this combined effort was a stunningly effective defensive victory. Of the more than 300 drones and missiles launched by Iran and its proxies, well over 95% were intercepted and destroyed before they could reach their targets. The vast majority were brought down outside of Israeli airspace by American, British, and Allied forces. The handful of ballistic missiles that did manage to penetrate the dense layers of defense were the exception, not the rule. This success was a powerful testament to technological superiority and the strength of military alliances. But it came at a monumental cost, with billions of dollars worth of advanced interceptor missiles expended in a single night to counter a far cheaper offensive barrage. As dawn broke over Israel on the 18th of February, 2026, the scale of the Iranian attack was clear, but so too was the remarkable success of the defensive shield. The streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, while tense, were not scenes of widespread devastation. The apocalyptic scenario that many had feared had not come to pass. Civil defense crews were dealing with the aftermath, which largely consisted of falling debris from the hundreds of successful interceptions. Sirens had wailed throughout the night, sending millions of Israelis to shelters, but the physical impact on civilian life was, thankfully, minimal. The psychological impact, however, was profound. The nation had collectively stared into the abyss of a direct attack from its most powerful adversary. The few ballistic missiles that had evaded interception did cause some damage, but it was concentrated and limited. The primary target hit was the Nevatim Air Base in the southern Negev desert. Military spokespersons were quick to release imagery showing minor damage to a taxiway and an empty hangar. They stressed that the base remained fully operational, with aircraft continuing to take off and land. This carefully managed release of information was designed to project an image of resilience and control, reassuring the Israeli public, while simultaneously downplaying the effectiveness of the Iranian strike. The reality was that a few missiles hitting a critical military installation was a serious breach, regardless of the limited damage. It quickly became apparent that Iran's primary objective was not to inflict maximum destruction but to make a powerful statement. Following the 5-hour barrage, Iran's mission to the United Nations issued a declaration stating that the operation was concluded. The statement framed the attack as a legitimate and proportional response to the Israeli strike in the Bekaa Valley, citing Article 51 of the UN Charter on Self-Defense. Tehran was signaling to the international community that having demonstrated its capability and restored a measure of deterrence, it considered the matter closed. This was a classic de-escalatory message wrapped within an act of massive escalation, an attempt to control the narrative and put the onus for what happened next squarely on Israel. This Iranian posture created an incredibly complex situation for Israel's leaders. While the defensive systems had performed brilliantly, the fact remained that a sovereign nation had launched hundreds of munitions directly at their territory. The attack represented the most significant military confrontation between the two nations in their long and bitter history. The psychological barrier had been broken. Iran had proven its willingness to risk all-out war with a direct strike. For the Israeli government and its populace, the question was not whether the attack had failed in its destructive potential, but what it meant for the future. The precedent had been set, and a new, more dangerous strategic reality had dawned. Inside the secure underground command center of the Kirya, Israel's war cabinet convened in an atmosphere of grim resolve. The room was a nexus of immense pressure. On one side was the overwhelming success of the nation's air defenses, a victory that had prevented a national catastrophe and provided a sliver of room for deliberation. On the other side was the stark reality that Iran had shattered a decades-old taboo by launching a direct attack from its own soil. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his political future already hanging by a thread due to long-standing legal battles and public discontent, knew that any perceived weakness in his response could be politically fatal. The voices within the cabinet were divided. Hardline ministers, representing the far-right flank of the government, argued for an immediate and massive retaliatory strike against Iran. They contended that anything less would be interpreted as a sign of fear, inviting further and more devastating attacks in the future. Their position was that deterrence once lost could only be re-established through overwhelming force. They called for strikes not just on military sites but also on strategic infrastructure and perhaps even targets related to Iran's nuclear program, arguing that this was a unique opportunity to deliver a crippling blow to the regime in Tehran. More cautious voices, including senior figures from the military and intelligence communities, urged restraint. They pointed to the immense diplomatic and military capital spent by the United States and other allies in defending Israel just hours before. President Trump, in a phone call with the Prime Minister, had counseled caution, making it clear that while American support for Israel's defense was ironclad, the United States would not participate in any offensive operations against Iran. These officials argued that a massive Israeli retaliation would alienate crucial allies, squander the international goodwill gained from weathering the attack, and almost certainly plunge the entire region into a devastating multi-front war that Israel could ill afford. The Prime Minister was caught in the middle of this strategic vice. He faced intense domestic pressure to hit back hard, to restore the nation's sense of security, and his own reputation as a strong leader. Yet, he was also acutely aware of the limits of Israeli power and the catastrophic risks of unbridled escalation. A full-scale war with Iran, likely drawing in Hezbollah from the north and other proxies, would be a conflict of a magnitude Israel had not seen in generations. The decision he faced was monumental: how to formulate a response that was forceful enough to deter Iran, yet calibrated enough to avoid triggering the very regional conflagration that everyone feared was just one misstep away. After hours of intense debate, the Israeli war cabinet settled on a course of action that threaded the needle between a full-scale retaliation and, perceived inaction. The decision was to execute a limited surgical strike designed to send a clear and unambiguous message of capability directly to the Iranian leadership, without causing the mass casualties that would make a further Iranian response obligatory. The plan was a model of modern asymmetric warfare, leveraging technological superiority over brute force. It was to be a demonstration that Israel could penetrate Iran's own air defenses at will, touching its most sensitive sites without triggering an all-out war. The operation, launched under the cover of darkness approximately 10 hours after the initial Iranian barrage had ended, was subtle and sophisticated. Instead of a large wave of fighter jets, which would have been easily detected, Israel deployed a small squadron of advanced quadcopter drones. Launched from within Iranian territory by clandestine special forces or allied groups, these small drones were used to create confusion, activating Iranian air defense radar around the city of Isfahan. This electronic feint served to distract and misdirect the defenders, creating a window of opportunity for the real attack that was to follow moments later. It was a clever use of low-cost technology to outwit a conventional state-level defense system. While Iranian air defenses were preoccupied with the drone swarm, the core of the Israeli strike was launched. From fighter jets flying safely in Syrian airspace, well outside the range of Iran's primary air defense envelope, a small number of air-launched missiles were fired. These were not blockbuster bombs aimed at leveling buildings, but precision-guided munitions with a very specific target. Their destination was the advanced S-300 air defense battery, protecting the Isfahan air base, and by extension, the nearby Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. The strike was a direct challenge, a way of telling Tehran, "We can get past your best defenses and touch your most critical assets whenever we choose." The impact was precise and symbolic. The missiles struck their target, damaging or destroying the radar and launcher components of the air defense system. There were no significant casualties reported, which was by design. The message was delivered not with a sledgehammer, but with a scalpel. Israel had demonstrated its reach and technological edge, responding to Iran's massive but largely ineffective barrage with a quiet, highly effective, and deeply humiliating counterpunch. The ball was now back in Iran's court. The leadership in Tehran was faced with a new dilemma: to absorb this embarrassing blow or to double down, and climb another rung on the perilous ladder of escalation. The Israeli strike on the Isfahan air defense battery, though physically limited, was a profound psychological blow to Tehran. The regime interpreted the attack not as a measured tit-for-tat response, but as a brazen dress rehearsal for a much larger Israeli or American operation against its nuclear facilities. The hardliners' narrative, which had been momentarily quieted after Iran's initial concluded operation, now gained unstoppable momentum. They argued that Israel's surgical strike was a test of their resolve, and any failure to respond with overwhelming force would be seen as a green light for a full-scale assault. The decision was made to escalate, and to do so dramatically. Within hours, Iran unleashed a second wave of attacks, far larger and more indiscriminate than the first. This was not a carefully calibrated signal. This was an act of fury. Hundreds more ballistic and cruise missiles were launched from across Iran, this time, not just at military bases, but also at strategic economic targets, including power stations and port facilities. The goal was to inflict real pain, to move beyond symbolic strikes, and impose a tangible cost on the Israeli state. The skies over the Middle East once again became a battleground, as Allied and Israeli air defenses, their interceptor stockpiles partially depleted from the first wave, scrambled to counter an even greater onslaught. Simultaneously, Iran activated its most powerful proxy force. Under direct orders from Tehran, Hezbollah began a massive bombardment of northern Israel. This was not the familiar low-level exchange of fire that had characterized the border for months. Instead, it was a torrent of hundreds of rockets, drones, and short-range missiles aimed at cities like Kiryat Shmona and military command posts across the Galilee. Hezbollah commandos, under the cover of the intense barrage, were directed to conduct cross-border raids, attempting to attack IDF positions and briefly occupy territory, escalating the northern front from a persistent nuisance into a full-blown war zone. This coordinated multi-front assault represented a nightmare scenario for Israel's military planners. The nation was now engaged in a high-intensity defensive battle against missile attacks from the east, while simultaneously fighting a conventional ground and air battle against a well-armed paramilitary army in the north. the sheer volume of incoming threats from both Iran and Lebanon began to strain even the most advanced air defense systems. Some missiles and rockets inevitably got through, causing more significant damage and, for the first time, civilian casualties. The conflict had crossed a new threshold, moving from a contained exchange to a rapidly expanding regional war, with the first 24 hours drawing to a close amid chaos and uncertainty. Despite the terrifying escalation in the air and on the northern border, the prospect of a direct large-scale land war between Iran and Israel remained highly improbable. The fundamental constraint was geography. The two nations are separated by nearly 1,000 kilometers, with the territories of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan lying between them. For Iran to mount a ground invasion, it would have to move vast armored divisions and hundreds of thousands of troops across these countries. Such a maneuver would be impossible to hide and would almost certainly trigger a devastating response from the United States, which maintains a significant military presence in both Iraq and Syria and is a staunch ally of Jordan. The military balance sheet between the two adversaries also revealed a tale of asymmetric strengths. On paper, Iran held a substantial advantage in manpower, with a combined active and reserve force of over 1.2 million personnel, dwarfing Israel's approximately 750,000. However, a significant portion of Israel's forces were highly trained and technologically proficient reservists who could be rapidly mobilized. In terms of conventional hardware, Israel possessed clear superiority. Its armored core, with over 2,200 advanced Merkava tanks, was nearly double the size and far more modern than Iran's fleet. Critically, the Israeli Air Force, equipped with American F-35 and F-15 stealth fighters, held uncontested air superiority over the region. Iran's primary military strength, as demonstrated in the first 24 hours, lay in its missile arsenal. It possesses the largest and most diverse collection of ballistic and cruise missiles in the Middle East, a capability it has spent decades developing as its primary tool for power projection and deterrence. This allows Tehran to strike targets across the region without having to risk its conventional air force or navy in a direct confrontation. Israel, for its part, countered this with its own deep strike capabilities, including Jericho intercontinental ballistic missiles, and, it is widely believed, a nuclear deterrent delivered via submarines, providing the ultimate guarantee against an existential threat. These realities meant that any wider conflict would not be fought by tank armies clashing in the desert. Instead, it would be a war defined by other means. It would be a battle of missile barrages versus air defenses, of precision airstrikes against hardened targets, and, most crucially, of proxy warfare. Iran's strategy would rely on activating its network of allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Syria and Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, to bog Israel down in a multi-front, attritional conflict. Israel's strategy would be to leverage its technological and air power advantages to inflict crippling damage on Iran and its proxies, while relying on its defensive systems to weather the storm. As the first chaotic 24 hours drew to a close, the conflict threatened to spill over into the maritime domain, opening yet another front in the escalating war. The strategic waterways of the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of global trade flows, became immediate flashpoints. Iran's navy, though no match for the United States Fifth Fleet, began escorting its commercial vessels and oil tankers, while the IRGC's naval wing increased its aggressive posturing in the Persian Gulf. The recent seizure of the merchant vessel MCS Ares served as a stark reminder of Iran's ability to disrupt shipping, a potent economic weapon in its arsenal. The most immediate maritime threat came from Iran's Yemeni proxies, the Houthis. Emboldened by the direct confrontation between their patron and Israel, they would almost certainly intensify their campaign of missile and drone attacks against commercial and naval vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This would force the United States and its coalition partners to divert even more naval assets to defensive operations, protecting vital shipping lanes. An Iranian order to close the Strait of Hormuz, a threat recently brandished during military drills, remained a worst-case scenario. Such a move would be an act of economic war against the entire world, likely triggering a massive international military response led by the United States. The initial day of conflict had redrawn the map of the Middle East, transforming a long-running shadow war into a direct, hot conflict. The carefully constructed walls of deterrence had been breached, first by Iran, and then by Israel, setting a dangerous new precedent. The actions had forced other regional powers, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, into a perilous position. While officially neutral, their tacit cooperation with Western and Israeli air defense efforts would not have gone unnoticed in Tehran, placing them at risk of becoming targets in a wider conflagration. The entire region was now a tinderbox, with sparks flying in every direction. As the world watched with alarm, the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. The rapid escalation had demonstrated the terrifying potential for miscalculation and the speed at which a regional crisis could spiral towards a global one. The first 24 hours had been a brutal exchange of blows, a test of military capability and national will. What remained unknown was whether the leaders in Tehran and Jerusalem, having now unleashed their power, possessed the wisdom and restraint to pull back from the abyss. The alternative was a continued escalation that threatened to consume the Middle East in a firestorm of a magnitude not seen in generations, with devastating consequences for the entire world.